The Black Death was a golden age for workers. As roughly half of Europe died, the survivors became the richest generation the medieval world had ever seen. This sounds impossible. We are taught that the plague was an apocalypse that destroyed medieval civilization. But if you look at the tax records from the year 1350, you find something that shouldn't exist. Peasants were suddenly wearing furs and eating steak. Why did medieval kings try to ban being rich? This is no history. And today, we're going to look at how the worst disaster in history created the modern economy. Everyone knows the story of the Black Death. You've probably heard the same statistics I did in school. History books often tell you that between 1347 and 1351, a plague swept out of the East and killed 1/3 of the population. For a long time, this was the standard estimate, a narrative of total, unmitigated ruin. And the evidence seems to support it. When you read the chronicles from the time, they sound like the end of the world. The Italian writer Boccaccio described a society where all laws, human and divine, had dissolved. Fields were left unplowed. Villages were abandoned to the wolves. The economy, we are told, collapsed completely because there was no one left to buy or sell anything. It makes sense when you think about it. If 1 out of every 3 people vanished today, our global supply chains would shatter. Labor would grind to a halt. Money would become worthless. I believed this version of history for years. It fits our understanding of disaster. Death leads to poverty. Mass death leads to mass suffering. This is the story of the Black Death as a tragedy that took centuries to recover from. But there's a problem with this story. It's not what the survivors experienced. When you look closer at the decades immediately following the plague, something doesn't add up. In 1363, just a decade after the plague ended, the English Parliament passed a strange set of laws. They were called sumptuary laws, and they were designed to control what people could wear and eat. Specifically, they forbade common laborers from wearing furs like ermine or vair. They banned servants from eating more than 1 meal of meat or fish per day. Here is the question that started to bug me. If the economy was in ruins and everyone was destitute, why did the king need to ban peasants from wearing luxury furs? You don't pass a law banning homeless people from driving Ferraris. You only pass that law if the homeless people have suddenly started buying them. The existence of these laws implies that the poor weren't poor anymore. Then I found another piece of evidence that contradicts the ruin narrative. Historians call it the price scissors. After 1370, the price of grain, the food of the poor, crashed. But the price of manufactured goods, tools, clothes, ironwork, skyrocketed. If the economy had simply collapsed, all prices should have fallen together, or risen together due to scarcity. But they moved in opposite directions. This suggests a fundamental shift in the power dynamic of the medieval world. So if the total collapse theory isn't true, what actually happened? To find out, we need to look at the body count again, because the number we've all been taught was only part of the story. Let's start with the scale of the disaster, because this dictates everything that follows. For decades, historians repeated the 1/3 statistic. It was an estimate based on literary sources, chroniclers guessing at the horror around them. But in recent years, historians like Ole Benedicto have looked past the stories and into the hard data of tax receipts and tithe rolls. He used what is essentially forensic accounting on the Middle Ages. When a priest died, a new one had to be appointed and registered. By tracking these appointments across Europe, the data revealed a much darker picture. Modern research suggests the toll was far higher than previously thought. In many regions, the death rate reached as high as 60%. In some English villages, it was 80%. Imagine a room of 10 people. 6 of them die in a matter of weeks. This distinction between a third and two-thirds is critical. If you lose 30% of a workforce, you have a recession. If you lose 60%, you have a complete inversion of the supply and demand curve. This led to the first phase of the economic miracle, the supply shock. In 1349 and 1350, the crops were rotting in the fields. The feudal lords, who owned all the land, suddenly faced a terrifying reality. They had thousands of acres of land, but no one to harvest it. Land, which had been the most valuable asset in Europe for 1,000 years, suddenly became worthless without labor. A lord might have had 50 peasants working his estate before the plague. Now he had 20. And those 20 survivors realized something. They realized they were the only game in town. This brings us to the second phase, the wage explosion. For centuries, peasants were tied to the land, effectively slaves called serfs. But now, if a lord refused to pay them better, they could just walk away. The lord down the road was so desperate, he would offer double the wages, free housing, and meat at every meal. The ruling class panicked. They tried to use the law to stop market forces. In 1351, the King of England issued the Statute of Labourers. It is a fascinating document because you can hear the desperation in the text. It complains about the malice of servants who are idle and not willing to serve without excessive wages. The law commanded that everyone under the age of 60 must work, and crucially, it mandated that wages be frozen at pre-plague levels. It was a wage cap, a desperate attempt to turn back the clock. But here is where the story gets really interesting. The law failed. And it failed because of the lords themselves. The desire for profit outweighed class solidarity. Lords ignored the king's law and paid the higher wages anyway, because if they didn't, their harvest would rot. By the 1380s, real wages for unskilled laborers in England had doubled. This leads to the final, most transformative phase, the consumption revolution. With double the money and half the competition, the standard of living for the average European skyrocketed. Before the plague, a peasant's diet was almost entirely bread and pottage, a grain soup. After the plague, records show laborers demanding and getting fresh meat, fish, and dairy every day. In some regions, women found new, temporary opportunities in trades and guilds that were previously closed to them, as the labor shortage forced a crack in patriarchal structures. This explains the price scissors we saw earlier. Grain prices fell because the population had crashed. There were fewer mouths to feed. But wages rose, meaning people had disposable income for the first time. They stopped spending all their money on basic survival and started buying things. They bought better clothes, better tools, better beer. This drove up the price of manufactured goods, shifting power from the land-owning lords to the artisans and merchants. In Western Europe, the Black Death didn't just kill people. It broke the back of the feudal system. But this wasn't universal. In Eastern Europe, the crisis often led to a second serfdom, where lords used the chaos to tighten their legal grip on the remaining peasantry. And that's when I realized the truth. We tend to view the Black Death as a pause button on progress, a dark age where everything stopped. But for the survivors in the West, the evidence shows it was actually a fast-forward button. The scarcity of humans made humans valuable. Before the plague, labor was cheap and life was expendable. After the plague, labor was the most precious resource in Europe. It wasn't a collapse, it was a correction. The survivors didn't just inherit the clothes of the dead, they inherited the leverage to demand a better life. The golden age of labor wasn't a myth, it was the direct mathematical consequence of tragedy. This reminds us that the relationship between labor and power is simple. Scarcity drives value. When workers are rare, workers are powerful. The Black Death teaches us that sometimes the most horrific events in history can break systems that seemed unbreakable. In the West, it forced the elite to share the wealth, not out of kindness, but out of necessity. But the Black Death isn't the only time a global disaster completely rewired the economy. I'm here to help you know the merchants who shaped empires. What other economic myths should we investigate next? Tell me in the comments. See you on the next trade route.